Hello, this is Rob Hopkins in Devon, down in the southwest, in Totnes. Very happy to have been asked to say a few words to your event today, to the Salisbury Eco Festival. Sorry I can't be there in person, but it's wonderful to hear that it's happening, and it's wonderful to hear that Transition Salisbury is Transition Salisbury City, or Salisbury Transition City, is kind of bursting forth at this time in the evolution of the world and of Salisbury itself. And I've been asked to say a few words about why imagination matters, why it matters that we think about 2030, why it matters that we bring sort of transition thinking to the challenges that we have. So I just recently wrote this book all about imagination called From What Is to What If, and I did that because I kept reading people who I really admire and really respect, like Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein and people like that, who would say things like climate change is a failure of the imagination. And then they'd move off and start talking about something else. And I was kind of left there going, that's interesting. What do you mean climate change is a failure of the imagination? Why would it be in 2020, at a time when we're faced with these huge existential challenges, that we're experiencing a failure of the imagination? Surely we're more brilliant at anything than we've ever been, and everything is fabulous. And I started sort of digging into it and researching into it, and like I set out in the book, I came to the conclusion that actually in 2020 what's happened is we have really allowed our collective imagination to slide. We have created the perfect conditions for our imagination muscle, which should be like that, to actually kind of be more like this. And we recognise that in a population where, if people don't get a proper diet, that if people are not well nourished enough, that we will see a rise in preventable illnesses and so on. We recognise that in a population where we have a poor education system, that people are going to really struggle to attain their potential. And yet, just slightly out of our eye range, or whatever the word is, our collective imagination is just kind of dwindling because we're creating the conditions for that to happen. We have an education system that doesn't value the imagination, and indeed distrusts it profoundly, and creates very little space for it. Most people's work-life experience is that imagination is afforded very little space. Our experience of politics gives very little invitation for us to be imaginative. We know that imagination needs certain things. Imagination needs space in our own lives. Our best ideas come to us when we have some space in our lives. Albert Einstein always said his best ideas came to him when he was riding his bicycle through a forest. And our best ideas don't tend to come to us when we're sitting in front of a laptop with a deadline of 8 o'clock that night. Imagination needs places that inspire us to look at possibilities differently. Places we go to, small places, big places, that are just part of our everyday experience, where after we've been there, we kind of don't look at the future quite in the same way. They can be just like a little garden on a street. They could be a kind of a particular place, or urban gardens, or even a whole city. Maybe Salisbury itself by 2030 will become one of those places that people from all around come to have their imagination stretched in terms of what's possible. We know that the imagination needs practices, it needs certain things that we can come together and to do with other people, and some of those I suggest in the book. But we need these things we can do together at a time when our imaginations are sort of shrunk and slightly desiccated, to kind of stretch that out again and say, right, okay, no, actually anything is possible. We could do anything now. What would Salisbury look like in 2030? We could completely rethink that. So having those practices is really important. And then the last thing I think we need, that's fundamental to this, is what I call pacts, which is this idea that, all of you watching this will have had times where you are invited to a consultation or something by your local council or an organisation, and you go along and you write your brilliant ideas on post-it notes, and then you go home and they just chuck them all in the bin and do what they were going to do anyway. There's something really important to me about when you invite the imagination, that you are prepared to meet it in the middle, that you are prepared to meet it halfway, and to actually put it into practice. And for me, that idea came from the story of a fabulous thing in Bologna in Italy called the Civic Imagination Office. And a Civic Imagination Office invites people in Bologna to bring their ideas, their dreams, their visions of how the future could be, and then to and then when those ideas are generated, it says, that's a great idea. Let's do that. Let's make a pact. We can offer this, this, and this. What can you offer? That and that? Okay, good. Let's make a pact. And in Bologna, in the last 5 years, they've made 500 pacts that range from little tiny little things like making a new garden outside in a street to big things like turning an old office block into a centre to teach young people to become classical musicians. So pacts are really important because in our society, in our culture, we tend to kind of talk about imagination, but then we give it no respect. We don't give it any. We don't meet it in the middle at all. One of the things that I've learned from researching the book about imagination that I just think is so interesting is that the imagination thrives best when it has limits put around it. So if I said, "Tell me a story," you might think, "Oh my God." But if I said, "Tell me a story about a mouse that has a little blue hat and he lives under a piano in your house and he writes his own music," I've put limits around it, and it's much easier within that to be imaginative. So, which is why my experience is always that the people now who understand the climate emergency and have kind of internalized and digested the climate emergency are coming up with by far the most imaginative solutions. If you are someone like Donald Trump who imagines there are no limits to anything, actually the ideas you come up with are really boring and really unimaginative. It's one of the reasons I love the whole concept of donut economics so much. They say, actually, as a city, as a town, we can no longer push out into the planetary boundaries that undermine our ability to live into the future on this planet, and we can no longer eat into the middle of the donut, which is kind of reducing living standards for people and not taking social justice into account. And in that sweet spot that results what they call the donut, that creates so much scope for imagination. How are we going to fit in this space? How are we all going to work together better? What are the businesses we're going to need? What's the technologies we're going to need? What's the economic system we're going to need? All of that is just beautiful. And so if there's one thing that I would like to bring to the 2030 festival, it is the idea, to the Salisbury Eco Festival, and this thinking about 2030, it is the idea that thinking in this way and bringing an acknowledgement of the profound urgency of the climate emergency and what that means in terms of what we need to do offers the possibility that the next 10 years could lead to a revolution in imagination in Salisbury. It could just be the time of everybody's lives where anything felt possible and where all kinds of organisations come together to dream and imagine, because the 2030 that it is still possible that we could achieve is so delicious. And what I try to do in the work that I do is to create a longing for that. How do we create a longing for a future in which we had done everything we could possibly have done, and we have created a zero carbon Salisbury? How do we create a longing for that? We don't create that longing with facts and figures and graphs and policy documents. We create that longing through storytelling, through dreams, through art, through music. We need storytelling. How do we really bring it alive for people? Because when I close my eyes and I try to imagine what 2030 could be like if we did everything, I imagine a future with far less cars. A city where that space has been taken back from cars, and we now have an incredible, dazzling diversity of public transport and scooters and bicycles and all sorts of 2-3-wheeled ways of getting around the place, plus a really great public transport system. And the space that has freed up, all that car parking that we don't need anymore, all those car parks and all those streets that were just full of cars are now taken back, and a space is full of play and food being grown and trees and communities coming together. I imagine a space, a city which is much more connected to the land around it, and that's reflected in its markets. We see less supermarkets, we see more kind of vibrant markets, more local food growers delivering to people's homes, more of a culture of people cooking together, a whole range of flavours and tastes and drinks and beers and breads that in 2020 nobody could even imagine what those would taste like, and are now just part of our everyday lives. Schools that are part of that network that produce more food than they consume and more energy that they can consume, and where kids' daily life in school is really one of living the kind of sustainable future that we need, that is just rolled through education. By 2030, testing will have been outlawed in schools, and it'll be much more hands-on and practical, much more focused on building imaginative young people who can problem solve, and who don't just say, aren't given a problem to which there is only one solution, but are given problems to which there are an infinite number of solutions. I imagine it as a place where Salisbury has achieved being a zero carbon city, where there are no more gas boilers in people's homes, there are air source heat pumps, the homes are hugely energy efficient. We have an economy which is based on the idea of maximising the amount of transactions between local businesses, that we try and circulate the money locally rather than allowing lots of big national organisations and international chains to act as extractive industries, just taking money out of Salisbury and sending it off to the Cayman Islands or wherever, that money circulates locally, and that's where the economic resilience of a city like Salisbury comes from. It's a city where the bird song is now louder than the traffic. It's a city where there are now more trees than people. It's a city where fruit and nut trees line the streets. I think it's going to be amazing. Who would want to do anything other than that? You know, one of the things that's so interesting as we emerge out of COVID-19 is that opinion polls, consistently say that the number of people who say we don't want to go back to how it was before, and we want to use this as the opportunity to bounce forward to something better, to a low carbon society, something like 90%, sort of 95% of people saying we don't want how it was before. This is the golden moment of opportunity to reimagine and rebuild everything. And if we have a national government who seem set on just going back to how things were as much as they can, then it really falls to us as communities, as businesses, as local governments, to come together and to say, no, this is the moment, this is the opportunity. We're not going to get a second. 2008 was our first attempt to opportunity to really reimagine everything. This is the second and probably the last opportunity we're going to get from a climate science perspective to be really bold and really brave and really imaginative. So let's seize it. Let's do that. It'll need all of us coming together. It'll need, whether you work in local finance or local education, or whether you run a local business, you're all needed in this process to come together. But to you know, one of the things I do when I work with groups is I say one of the thing that is the death of imagination is the words we hear all the time. Yes, but, you know, all of those of you who are out in the world and who make suggestions like, hey, how about we do this? Yes, but, you know, we get met with this kind of like cold water poured on any sort of imaginative ideas. And I think we need to be really good at mastering the art of yes and. That when somebody suggests something, we go, yeah, and you build off that, like people do when they do improv theatre, which I really recommend, by the way. So one of the arts I think that we need to master over the next couple of years, as well as the ability to say yes and, is the ability to ask really great what-if questions. And in the book and in various things I do, I like to tell some of my favourite stories where I've seen what if lead to phenomenal change. And one of those is in Belgium, in Liège, which is quite a big city in Liège, former industrial city. And about 6 years ago, the transition group in Liège came up with a what-if question. And their what-if question was, what if in generations' time, the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? Such a beautiful question. They organised a big event. They invited all the farmers and academics and chefs and baristas and anyone who cared about food. Loads of people came. And they launched this what-if question, really kind of audaciously and imaginatively. And I went to that event. It was amazing. I then went back 4 years later. So last year I went back. And in that time they had started 25 new cooperatives. They raised €5 million of investment from local people. They started a farm, 2 vineyards, a brewery, a shop, a local currency that runs through the whole thing. The shop was doing so well that they now have 4 shops in the centre of the city. And I met the mayor of the city who said, well, we used to say we wanted to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. This is the story of our city. And our role is just to get out of the way, is to remove obstacles from this from growing. And they're now working with the council to reimagine how the how the hospitals and universities and the schools feed themselves through this thing which is called ceinture alimentaire, which means food belt. For me, it's really emotional going to see, because I've spent the last 12, 13 years in the transition movement going around with this kind of idea in my imagination of how the future could be. In Liège, it's there. I can go and sit in it and have my lunch in it and see people employed by it. It's just magical. If they can do that in Liège, you can do that in Salisbury too. You know, they started with a really good what-if question, a really powerful narrative, and getting the right people in the room together. And as we emerge from COVID-19, this is absolutely the perfect time to have those conversations. People now recognise that the idea that we need to make our cities more food resilient is not any longer the terrain solely of sort of progressive Guardian reading, organic food eating people. It is an area of concern for everybody. We've seen the fragility of our food system during COVID-19, and this is the time to really reimagine and build everything and rebuild everything. One of the other what-if stories I love is from Tooting, where Transition Town Tooting was saying there's nowhere in Tooting that's like our space, that's like a town square or a village green or somewhere we can just go and sort of hang out, that is a kind of a people's space. And someone said, well, there's a place that it could be, which is over there, which is the bus turning circle, which is a big round area of road, normally just full of buses, waiting to be called to go somewhere else with their engines idling. And they said, that should be our village green. So they did a crowdfunder, they raised £2,000, they spent a day. They did an event called the Tooting Twirl, where they took that space over and filled it with flowers. They put real grass down on the tarmac. They filled it with flowers and coffee and music and creativity and carnival, and spent a day living as if it was their village green. And I was there all day, and it was so interesting to see how the conversation started out with people saying, if this was our village green, and by the end they were saying, when this is our village green, something profoundly shifted under their feet. The kind of tectonic plates of possibility started to move around as the day went on. If they can do it in Tooting, if they can do it in Liège, if they can do it in many, many other places, Amsterdam is now going to be the first donut economics city in the world. If they can do it in Amsterdam, you can absolutely do it in Salisbury. You know, we have 10 years to get to being zero carbon towns and cities. Salisbury could be leading the way, absolutely. It requires catalyzing, it requires collaboration, it requires a sense of carnival and possibility, and it requires cultivating that deep, deep sense of longing that really is what will fundamentally get us there, and bringing it alive in people's imagination just how extraordinary and delicious and wonderful 2030 could be if we did absolutely everything that we could possibly do. So I wish you all the best for an absolutely glorious Salisbury Eco Festival, and I just want to leave you with a quote that I start the book with, which hopefully will be a useful contribution to your event. It's by Neil Gaiman, who writes novels for young people. We all, adults and children, have an obligation to daydream. We have an obligation to imagine. It's easy to pretend that nobody can change anything, that we're in a world in which society is huge and the individual is less than nothing, an atom in a wall, a grain of rice in a rice field. But the truth is, individuals change their world over and over. Individuals make the future, and they do it by imagining things can be different. I so look forward to hearing all the delicious stories emerging from Salisbury, inspired by the Salisbury Eco Festival, of all the glorious things that went on to happen and the profound and delightful change that resulted from it. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.